The crystal halls of the Scythery Palace glowed with pale blue light as Princess Calith Vel Sithari walked through the corridors she had known since birth. She was tall, even by the standards of her people, her skin shimmering with the soft bioluminescence that marked the royal bloodline of the Scythery Dominion, and her eyes were the color of deep starlight, silver and cold, and full of a pride that had been placed there by centuries of noble heritage. The Scythery were among the oldest civilizations in the known galaxy, and they carried that knowledge in every step they took, in every word they spoke, in every breath they drew beneath the crystal spires of their ancient throne world, Velthara Prime. Calith was the third daughter of Empress Scythelin, and though she was not first in line for the throne, she was perhaps the sharpest mind among her sisters, a fact that the Empress herself had acknowledged more than once in the quiet privacy of the royal chambers. When the summons came that morning, delivered by a palace servant whose bioluminescence flickered with nervousness, Calith felt the first stir of unease in her chest. She found her mother in the throne of light, the great crystalline seat that floated above a pool of liquid starfire at the center of the palace's heart chamber. The Empress did not rise when Calith entered, and that alone told her something was wrong, because her mother always rose for her daughters. "Sit," the Empress said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had already made a decision and did not wish to discuss it. Calith did not sit. "You have been chosen," the Empress continued, and the crystal walls around them hummed faintly with the vibration of her words, "to serve the Dominion in a way that no daughter of this house has ever been asked to serve before." "What way?" Calith asked, keeping her voice steady, even as the unease in her chest grew sharper. "Be wed." Calith almost laughed, because royal marriages were common, and she had expected this day would come eventually. But then her mother's expression stopped the laugh before it could form. "You are to be wed to a human," the Empress said. The silence that followed was so complete that Calith could hear the liquid starfire bubbling beneath the throne. "A human," she repeated, and the word tasted strange in her mouth, like something bitter she had accidentally swallowed. "A captain of their military," the Empress said, "a man of what they consider comparable station, selected by the Terran Confederacy as part of the Treaty of Argent Crossing." Calith knew about the treaty, because everyone in the Dominion knew about the treaty, and everyone in the Dominion also knew the shame that had come before it. The war with the humans had been supposed to last 3 months at most, a quick disciplinary action against a young species that had expanded too close to Scythery borders, but instead it had lasted 2 brutal years, and ended not in the glorious Scythery victory that everyone had expected, but in a grinding and humiliating stalemate. The humans had no psychic abilities, no ancient technology, no bioluminescent gifts passed down through 10,000 years of careful breeding, and yet they had fought with a savagery and stubbornness that had shocked every admiral in the Scythery fleet. Colonies that should have fallen in days held for months, and human soldiers who should have surrendered chose instead to dig deeper into the rubble and keep fighting with broken weapons and bleeding hands. The Dominion had never faced anything like it, and though the official records called the outcome a mutual cessation of hostilities, every Scythery knew what it really was. It was the first war the Dominion had not won in over 1,000 years. And now her mother wanted her to marry one of them. "No," Calith said. The word came out harder than she intended, ringing off the crystal walls like a struck bell. "This is not a request," the Empress replied. "Then it is an insult," Calith shot back, and her bioluminescence flared bright with anger, casting sharp shadows across the chamber. "You would give a daughter of the royal house to a species that cannot even sense the psychic field, a species that lives barely 100 years before their bodies fail them, a species that was still burning fossil fuels on their homeworld when we were already old among the stars. I would give a daughter of the royal house to ensure that we do not lose another 100,000 soldiers in a war we cannot win," the Empress said, and her voice was quiet now, but no less sharp for it. That silenced Caliph for a moment, because she had not expected her mother to admit it so openly. The war had cost the Dominion far more than pride, and the numbers of the dead were still classified at that. Highest levels, but Caliph had seen the sealed reports because she had always found ways to see things she was not supposed to see. The humans had killed a staggering number of Scytheri warriors, and they had done it not with superior technology or psychic power, but with tactics that changed every single day, with weapons improvised from wreckage, with a terrifying willingness to sacrifice themselves so that their comrades could live. "I will not do this," Caliph said, but her voice was quieter now. "You will meet him at minimum," the Empress said. "The treaty demands it, and the Dominion's survival may depend on it." Caliph stared at her mother and searched for some sign of doubt or sympathy in those ancient glowing eyes, but she found only the cold certainty of a ruler who had weighed her daughter's happiness against the fate of an empire and made her choice. "Then I invoke the Kethvalen," Caliph said. The Empress's eyes narrowed, and for the first time in the conversation, something like surprise flickered across her face. The Kethvalen was an ancient rite, older than the palace itself, a law carved into the very foundation stones of Scytheri civilization, that granted any member of the royal house the right to refuse a betrothal for a period of 30 solar cycles, during which they could investigate and present formal cause for nullification. It had not been invoked in over 600 years. "You would go that far?" the Empress said, and it was not a question. "I would go further if I could," Caliph replied. The Empress studied her daughter for a long moment, and then she nodded slowly, and the crystal throne hummed with the weight of the decision being sealed into the royal record. "Very well," the Empress said. "You have your 30 cycles, but hear me clearly, Caliph. You will travel to the neutral station at Argent Crossing, and you will meet the human they have chosen for you, and if at the end of your investigation you cannot present valid cause for nullification, then you will honor the treaty, and you will marry him, and you will do so with the dignity of your bloodline." "And if I find cause?" Caliph asked. "Then the treaty will need to be renegotiated," the Empress said, "and the consequences of that will fall on all of us." Caliph turned and walked from the chamber without another word, her bioluminescence still burning bright with a fury she could barely contain. In her private quarters, she stood before the great window that overlooked the crystal city below, and she pressed her hands against the cool glass and tried to steady her breathing. A human. They wanted her to marry a human. She had read everything the Dominion's archives contained about the species, and none of it had impressed her even slightly, because they were loud and disorganized and emotionally volatile, and they solved problems through brute force and stubbornness, rather than elegance and wisdom. They aged visibly, their skin wrinkling and their hair turning gray in what seemed like the blink of an eye by Scytheri standards, and they could not touch the psychic field that connected all Scytheri minds in a web of shared thought and emotion. They were, by every measure Caliph could think of, beneath her. And yet, they had fought the Dominion to a standstill, and that single fact sat in her mind like a splinter she could not remove. She would go to Argent Crossing, she decided, and she would meet this human captain, and she would find every flaw and every failing and every reason why this marriage was an abomination against everything the Scytheri stood for. She would document his unworthiness so thoroughly that even her mother would have no choice but to agree. And then she would come home, and this nightmare would be over. She turned from the window and began to prepare for the journey. The man waiting for her at the end of it would be nothing like what she expected. Not even close. Argent Crossing was not what Caliph had expected. She had imagined something elegant, a station built with the kind of precision and beauty that the Sci-Theory brought to everything they constructed. But instead, the massive orbital platform floating in the demilitarized zone between Sci-Theory and Terran space looked like it had been assembled by two very different architects who had never spoken to each other. The left side of the station was pure Sci-Theory design, smooth crystal surfaces, and flowing bioluminescent corridors that hummed with gentle psychic resonance. And the right side was unmistakably human, all hard metal edges and exposed wiring, and signs written in a blocky script that Caliph found almost offensively plain. She arrived with an entourage of 12, including her personal guard captain Thyrus, and 2 court advisors who had been tasked with helping her document every failure of the human Groom for her Kethvalen case. Woman, whose bioluminescence never flickered because she had trained herself to maintain perfect emotional control, and she walked half a step behind Caliph at all times, with one hand resting on the ceremonial blade at her hip. The Terran delegation was scheduled to arrive before us, Thyrus said, as they moved through the Sci-Theory section of the station toward the central meeting chambers. And they are not here yet, Caliph asked. They are here, Thyrus said, and something in her voice made Caliph glance back at her. But they have not yet presented themselves formally. They are late to their own introduction, Caliph said, and she felt a grim satisfaction, because this was exactly the kind of disrespect she had expected. Note that for the record. One of her advisors, an elderly Sci-Theory named Pelith, who had spent decades studying alien cultures, nodded and made a mark on his datapad. They reached the central meeting hall, a grand chamber with a high arched ceiling, where the Sci-Theory crystal design merged uncomfortably with human steel, and found it already occupied, but not by a formal delegation. There were humans everywhere, and they were not standing in neat rows or waiting in respectful silence, the way any Sci-Theory delegation would have been arranged. 2 soldiers in rumpled uniforms were sitting on a bench near the far wall, playing some kind of card game and laughing so loudly that the sound echoed off the crystal surfaces in a way that made Caliph wince. A group of engineers had spread tools and mechanical parts across one of the diplomatic tables, and were arguing about something with such intensity that one of them kept jabbing his finger at a piece of equipment, while the others shook their heads. A woman in a medical uniform was wrapping bandages around the wrist of a large bearded man who was grinning despite the obvious pain. And when Caliph asked Thyrus what had happened, Thyrus said, flatly, that the man had broken his wrist in something called an arm wrestling contest. They injured themselves recreationally, Caliph said in disbelief. It appears so, Thyrus replied. Caliph stood at the entrance of the hall and waited for someone to notice her. And it took nearly a full minute before a young human officer looked up from his datapad, and his eyes went wide, and he scrambled to his feet so quickly that he knocked over a container of some dark liquid that Caliph later learned was called coffee. Oh, you must be the princess, the young man said, and he attempted a bow that was so awkward it looked more like he had tripped. I am so sorry, ma'am. We were told you would not be here for another hour. Let me get the director right away. He ran off before Caliph could respond, and she turned to Pelith with a look that said very clearly to document everything. The director turned out to be a gray-haired human woman named Ambassador Vasquez, who arrived within minutes, and who at least had the grace to look embarrassed. Your Highness, Vasquez said, and her bow was considerably better than the young officer's had been. I apologize for the state of things. We had a minor mechanical issue with our ship during transit, and the schedule got pushed around. Please let me assure you that this is not the impression we intended to make. And where is my intended groom? Caliph asked, letting every drop of ice she could muster flow into her voice. Vasquez hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and then smiled in a way that seemed genuinely apologetic. Captain Cole is finishing up some repairs on the lower deck, she said. We had a hull plate come loose during the approach, and he insisted on helping the engineering team fix it before he cleaned up for the formal introduction. "He is doing manual labor?" Kalis said. "He is, yes," Vasquez replied, and there was something in her tone that Kalis could not quite read, something that was not embarrassment but was closer to pride. "The man who is supposedly of comparable station to a princess of the Sci-Fi Dominion is on his hands and knees repairing a ship," Kalis said. "That is accurate," Vasquez said. Kalis looked at Thyrus, and Thyrus looked back, and neither of them needed to speak, because the psychic resonance between them said everything. This was going to be even easier than she had thought. Vasquez offered to give them a tour of the station while they waited, and Kalis accepted, because the more she observed, the more ammunition she would have for her case. And so she followed the human ambassador through the corridors of Argent Crossing, with her entourage trailing behind her like a glowing procession of disapproval. But as they walked, Kalis began to notice things that did not fit the picture she had built in her mind. They passed a human soldier in the corridor, was carrying not only his own heavy pack, but also the pack of another soldier who was limping beside him with a bandaged leg. And when Kalis asked Vasquez about it, the ambassador said simply that the two men were in the same unit, and that was what you did for the people in your unit. They passed the engineering bay, where the argument she had seen earlier was still going strong, and Vasquez explained that the engineers were debating the best way to fix an atmospheric processor in the Sci-Fi section of the station that had been declared irreparable by the Sci-Fi maintenance team. "Your people said it could not be fixed without replacement parts that would take weeks to arrive," Vasquez said. "Our chief engineer thinks she can get it working by tomorrow, using components from one of our coffee machines and some creative rewiring." "That is absurd," Kalis said. "Probably," Vasquez agreed, "but she has done more absurd things before, and most of them." They passed a mess hall where human crew members were eating together at long tables, and the noise was extraordinary, because everyone seemed to be talking at the same time. And officers sat beside common sailors, and shared food from the same plates. And a junior enlisted woman was telling a story that made an entire table of senior officers laugh so hard that one of them choked on his drink. In the Sci-Fi military, a junior speaking to a senior in that manner would have been grounds for formal reprimand. Here it seemed to be normal. "Why do your officers allow such familiarity?" Kalis asked Vasquez. "Because the best ideas do not always come from the highest rank," Vasquez said. "And a crew that is afraid to speak freely is a crew that will not tell you when you are about to fly into an asteroid." Kalis said nothing to that, but she filed it away in a part of her mind that was growing increasingly uncomfortable. And she continued observing, and with every passing minute she collected more evidence of human chaos and disorder and informality. And every piece of evidence told her she was right to reject this marriage. But beneath that certainty, in a place she would not have admitted existed, a small, quiet voice was asking a question she did not want to hear. If these people were truly as inferior as she believed them to be, then how had they fought the Sci-Fi Dominion to a standstill? How had this loud and messy and disorganized species held their ground against the most powerful military force in the galaxy? And why did the soldier carry his wounded comrade's pack without being asked, without being ordered, without even seeming to think about it? She pushed the question down and kept walking, and she told herself that she would have her answers soon enough when she finally met the man they expected her to marry. She told herself she already knew what she would find. She was wrong. He came to her covered in grease. That was the first thing Kalis noticed about Captain Marcus Cole when he finally walked into the formal reception chamber on Argent Crossing Station. And it nearly broke her composure entirely, because no one in the history of the Sci-Fi Dominion had ever appeared before a member of the royal family with engine grease on their hands. He had cleaned up somewhat, she could tell, because his dark hair was damp and his uniform was fresh. but there was still a smear of something dark along the edge of his jaw that he had clearly missed, and his boots were scuffed in a way that suggested they had seen years of hard use. He was not tall by Sci-Theory standards, and his build was solid but unremarkable, and his skin did not glow with any light at all, and when Kalith reached out with her psychic senses, as she did automatically with everyone she met, she found nothing. Absolute silence. It was like reaching into a dark room and finding it completely empty, and the sensation was so strange and unsettling that she almost took a step backward. "Your Highness," Marcus said, and he bowed, and his bow was neither clumsy like the young officer's, nor practiced like Ambassador Vasquez's, but somewhere in between, the bow of a man who had learned the gesture recently and performed it with simple sincerity. "Captain Cole," Kalith replied, and she kept her voice formal and distant, and let her bioluminescence dim to its coldest shade, because among the Sitheri that was a clear signal of displeasure. If Marcus noticed the signal, he gave no indication of it, and she supposed he would not, because humans could not read bioluminescent communication any more than they could touch the psychic field. "I apologize for the delay," he said, and his voice was calm and steady, and carried no trace of the nervousness she had expected. "We had a hull issue that needed attention, and I could not leave my crew to handle it alone." "You are a captain," Kalith said. "Surely you have subordinates who can perform manual repairs." "I do," Marcus agreed, "and they were performing them, and I was helping because that is what I do." There was no defiance in his tone, no challenge, just a simple statement of fact, delivered with a quiet confidence that Kalith found unexpectedly difficult to dismiss. She studied him more carefully now, and she saw things she had not noticed at first glance. His left hand was not made of flesh. It was cybernetic, a prosthetic of dark metal and synthetic fiber that moved with fluid precision when he gestured, and the transition point at his wrist was marked with a thin line of scar tissue that told her the original hand had not been lost cleanly. There were other scars too, a thin line along his temple that disappeared into his hair, a roughness to the skin on the left side of his neck that suggested burns that had healed but never fully faded, and his eyes, which were a plain brown color that the Sitheri would have considered utterly unremarkable, held something in their depths that she recognized. She had seen it in the eyes of Sitheri soldiers who had returned from the front lines. It was the look of someone who had seen things they could never forget. "You fought in the war," she said, and it was not a question. "I did," Marcus said. "At Hallis 4, she said, because she had read his file during the journey to Argent Crossing, and she knew exactly who he was. "Yes," he said, and something shifted in his expression, not pain exactly, but a heaviness that settled over his features like a shadow. Hallis 4 was a name that was spoken quietly in the halls of the Sitheri Military Command, because it had been one of the most humiliating chapters of the entire war. A human colony of barely 50,000 civilians, defended by a garrison of fewer than 2,000 soldiers, had held against a Sitheri siege force of 20,000 for 11 months. 11 months during which every assault was repelled and every tactical approach was countered, and every Sitheri commander who thought they had finally found the weakness in the human defenses discovered instead that the humans had already adapted. Kalith's own cousin, Commander Velrethis, had led the siege for the final 4 months, and he had returned home in silence, and had not spoken of the experience to anyone in the family since. "My cousin commanded the forces against you," Kalith said. "I know," Marcus said, and then he added something she did not expect. "He was a good commander, and I respected him, and I am glad he survived." Kalith blinked, and for a moment she did not know what to say, because no Sitheri had ever spoken of an enemy commander with that kind of simple, honest respect. "Walk with me," Marcus said, and then he seemed to realize that he had just given something very close to an order to a princess, and he corrected himself. "If you are willing, Your Highness, there is something on the station I think you should see." She should have refused because the formal introduction was supposed to follow a specific diplomatic protocol that involved seated discussions and the exchange of cultural gifts. But curiosity had always been her greatest weakness, and so she nodded and followed him. He led her to a section of the station she had not visited during Vasquez's tour, a quiet corridor that opened into a long hall with high ceilings and soft lighting. And when Kalith saw what filled the hall, she stopped walking. The walls were covered with names, thousands of them, tens of thousands, etched into panels of dark stone that lined both sides of the corridor, from floor to ceiling. And the names were written in two scripts, the flowing luminescent characters of the Sitheri language and the blocky angular letters of Terran Standard, side by side. "These are the dead," Kalith said softly. "All of them," Marcus said. "Every confirmed casualty from both sides, Sitheri and human. I insisted on it during the treaty negotiations, because the dead do not care which side they fought on, and they all deserve to be remembered." Kalith walked slowly along the wall, and her fingers hovered over the Sitheri names, without touching them. And she recognized some of them because she had read the casualty reports, and each name was a life that had ended in a war that should never have happened. "Why did you insist on including ours?" she asked. "Because your people were following orders just like mine were," Marcus said, "and the soldiers who died on your side had families who loved them, just like the soldiers who died on mine. And pretending otherwise does not make peace. It just makes a longer war." She turned to look at him, and she searched his face for deception or political calculation, or any sign that had doubts. These words were rehearsed for her benefit, and she found none of those things. She found only the quiet, steady gaze of a man who meant exactly what he said. "You do not want this marriage any more than I do," she said, and she said it bluntly because she wanted to see how he would react. "No," he admitted, and his honesty surprised her again. "I did not ask for this, and I would not have chosen it for myself. But I believe in what it represents, and I believe that if two people from two different worlds can find a way to stand together, then maybe two civilizations can do the same." "And what makes you think you are worthy of standing beside a princess of the Sitheri Dominion?" she asked, and she put every ounce of royal authority into the question. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and his brown eyes were steady and unafraid, and then he said something that she would remember for the rest of her very long life. "I am not," he said simply, "willing to try to be, and that is the most human thing I can offer you." Kalith said nothing, and they stood together in the Hall of the Dead, surrounded by the names of those who had fallen. And for the first time, since she had received the news of her betrothal, the certainty in her chest wavered. That night in her quarters on the station, she could not sleep, and after hours of restless turning, she sat up and opened her personal terminal and accessed the declassified military files from the siege of Hallis 4. She watched the footage for 3 hours. She watched human soldiers pulling wounded Sitheri warriors from collapsed buildings and carrying them to medical tents. She watched Marcus Cole, younger then and with both hands still made of flesh, standing in the rubble of a destroyed street and ordering his soldiers to share their rations with captured Sitheri prisoners who had not eaten in days. She watched a human medic working through the night to save the life of a Sitheri officer whose own people had given up on reaching in time. She watched a species that fought like cornered animals and then wept for their enemies. And when the footage ended and her quarters were dark and silent, Kalith sat very still and felt something crack inside the wall of certainty she had built around herself. She did not sleep that night, not even a little. In the days that followed, Kalith told herself that she was still gathering evidence for her Kefvalan case. She told herself that every moment she spent observing Marcus Cole and his people was an act of duty, a careful investigation designed to expose the fundamental unworthiness of the human species. and she told herself this so many times that she almost believed it. But something had changed inside her since the night she watched the footage from HFY 4. And though she would not yet admit what that change was, it had made the world look different in ways she could not ignore. Marcus invited her to visit New Cascadia, a human colony world in a nearby system that was still rebuilding from the war. And Caliph accepted the invitation, because she told herself it was an opportunity to see the humans in their natural environment and document their failings more thoroughly. Thyrus advised against it, warning that leaving the neutral station for a human world could be seen as a political concession. But Caliph overruled her, and they boarded a Terran transport shuttle that smelled like recycled air and engine oil, and something sweet that one of the human crew members told her was called cinnamon. New Cascadia was a green world with wide rivers and tall forests, and from orbit Caliph could see the scars of the war etched into its surface, dark patches where orbital strikes had burned away the vegetation and left the Earth exposed like wounds that had not yet healed. But as the shuttle descended, she began to see something else. Around every scar the forest was growing back, new trees reaching up through the blackened soil. And between the craters and the burn marks, there were fields of crops in neat rows, and clusters of buildings that were clearly new, built from whatever materials had been available, with more concern for function than beauty. The shuttle landed in the largest settlement, a town called Haven. Told her had been established by refugees during the war, and had simply kept growing afterward, because the people who had fled there had decided to stay and build something, instead of waiting for someone to build it for them. Haven was rough and imperfect in ways that would have horrified any Sci-Fi city planner. The streets were unpaved in places, and the buildings were mismatched in style and size, and there were children running through the open spaces, playing a game that involved throwing a ball, and screaming with a joy so loud and uncontained that Caliph could feel it pressing against her psychic senses like warm sunlight. And in the center of the town, standing in a small square surrounded by new construction, there was a monument she did not expect. It was a Sci-Fi War memorial. The stone was unmistakably Sci-Fi in design, carved with the traditional patterns of mourning that her people used to honor their fallen, and at its base were inscribed the names of the Sci-Fi soldiers who had died in the fighting on New Cascadia. "You preserved this," Caliph said, and she could not keep the surprise from her voice. "The colonists voted on it," Marcus said. "It was nearly unanimous. They said that the soldiers who died here were following orders, and deserved to be remembered, and that tearing down the memorial would not undo what happened." Caliph stared at the monument, and felt something tighten in her chest that she did not have a Sci-Fi word for. They walked through Haven, and Marcus introduced her to the people who lived there, and none of them treated her with the cold formality or the barely concealed hostility she had expected. An old woman with deep lines in her face and white hair tied back in a practical knot shook Caliph's hand, which was apparently a human greeting, and told her that she had lost a son in the war, and that she hoped the treaty would mean no other mother would lose a child the same. A young farmer showed her a field where he was growing hybrid crops, crossing Sci-Fi plant strains that had been shared during the early peace talks with Terran vegetables, to create something that grew faster and produced more food than either species could manage alone. The Sci-Fi seeds needed different soil conditions, the farmer explained, but we figured out that if we mix our compost with a mineral compound similar to what your homeworld produces, we can get them to take root, and the hybrid grows like nothing I have ever seen. "You experimented with our agricultural technology," Caliph said. "We experimented with it together," the farmer corrected gently. "A Sci-Fi botanist on the station shared the germination data, and our agronomists figured out the soil adaptation. Neither side could have done it alone." Caliph said nothing, but she looked at the field of green and purple plants growing in soil that had been scorched by war only a few years before. ago, and she thought about what it meant that these two species could create something new together that neither could create apart. She watched Marcus move through the town, and she saw something she had never seen in the royal courts of the Sci-Fi Dominion. He was not performing the role of a leader visiting his people. He was simply being among them, and the difference was so stark that it took her time to understand what she was seeing. He stopped to fix a broken fence post for an elderly couple, using his cybernetic hand to drive the post into the ground with a strength that surprised her, and they thanked him with the easy familiarity of people who had known him for years. He carried bags of supplies for the old woman who had lost her son, walking beside her and listening as she talked about her garden and her grandchildren and the weather. A small child ran up to him and grabbed his metal hand and stared at it with wide eyes and asked him if he was a patient robot. And Marcus laughed. It was a real laugh, full and warm and completely unguarded, and it was so different from any sound Caliph had ever heard in the crystal halls of her home that it stopped her in her tracks. In the Sci-Fi court, no one laughed like that, because laughter was controlled and measured and never louder than propriety allowed. But Marcus Cole laughed like a man who had forgotten that anyone was watching and did not care even if they were. And Caliph understood then what she had been struggling to name since the first day on Argent Crossing. The humans did not bind to each other through hierarchy. They bound to each other through choice. Their loyalty was not inherited or commanded, or woven into the psychic fabric of their being, the way Sci-Fi loyalty was. It was built piece by piece through 1,000 small acts of kindness and trust and sacrifice. And because it was chosen freely every single day, it could not be broken by decree or distance or even death. It was the most powerful thing she had ever encountered, and she had not even recognized it until now. The crisis came without warning that evening. An alarm sounded across the settlement, a harsh wailing tone that sent the humans into immediate motion, and Marcus was running before Caliph even understood what was happening. A reactor in a power station 3 kilometers outside Haven had malfunctioned, and the energy buildup was threatening to discharge in a way that could devastate the surrounding area, including a small farming community of 200 people. Marcus coordinated the evacuation from the back of a moving vehicle, shouting instructions into a communication device, while volunteers organized themselves around him with a speed and efficiency that seemed impossible for a people who had looked so disorganized just hours before. But they were not disorganized, Caliph realized as she watched them move. Organized differently than anything she had ever seen. Organized not by rank or command structure, but by trust. Each person knew what needed to be done, and they did it because they trusted the people around them, and because Marcus trusted them, and because that trust flowed in every direction like water finding its level. When the evacuation was nearly complete, and the reactor was entering critical failure, Marcus handed his communication device to his second officer and turned toward the power station. "Where are you going?" Caliph demanded. "The emergency shutdown requires manual activation," he said. "Someone has to get close enough to trigger it." "You will be killed," she said. "Probably not," he said, and then he ran toward the danger instead of away from it, and Caliph watched him go and felt something inside her break open that she could never put back together. The reactor's energy field was expanding, visible now as a shimmering distortion in the air, and Caliph realized with a sudden clarity that she could help because the energy pattern was similar to the bioluminescent frequencies her people used for psychic communication, and she could stabilize the field long enough for Marcus to reach the shutdown controls. She did not think about it. She did not weigh the political implications, or consider what her mother would say, or calculate the risks to her own safety. She simply raised her hands and let her bioluminescence blaze to its full intensity, brighter than she had ever pushed it before, and she reached out with her psychic abilities and wrapped them around the unstable energy field like hands cradling a flame. The field held. Marcus reached the controls and triggered the shutdown, and the reactor powered down with a deep groaning sound that Caliph felt in her bones. And then there was silence. Later, sitting in the ash and the settling dust, with the people of Haven gathering around them, in the fading light, Marcus sat down beside Caliph, and they were both breathing hard and covered in grime, and her bioluminescence was flickering with exhaustion. "Thank you," he said quietly, and Caliph realized with a feeling that filled her entire chest like warm light that she did not want to nullify the betrothal anymore. She did not want to go home and present her case and return to the Crystal Palace and pretend that she had not seen what she had seen. She wanted to stay right here, in this imperfect and messy and beautiful place, beside a man who ran toward danger because his people needed him, and who laughed like he meant it, and who had built a memorial for the enemy dead because it was the right thing to do. She did not say any of this out loud, but when Marcus offered her his hand, the cybernetic one with the metal fingers still warm from the reactor controls, she took it, and she did not let go for a very long time. The Crystal Throne Hall of Velthara Prime had not hosted a royal wedding in 47 years, and it had never in its 10,000-year history hosted a wedding between a Cytheri princess and an alien. The hall was vast, a cathedral of living crystal that rose in spiraling columns toward a ceiling so high it seemed to dissolve into light, and every surface glowed with the soft bioluminescence of the royal palace, shifting in slow waves of blue and silver and pale gold, as if the building itself was breathing. Caliph stood before the great mirror in her preparation chamber and studied her reflection with an expression that her handmaidens could not read. She was dressed in the traditional wedding garments of the Cytheri royal house, layers of flowing fabric that moved like liquid starlight, woven with threads of crystallized bioluminescent fiber that responded to her emotional state, and currently glowed with a steady warm radiance that she could not quite control. 2 weeks earlier, she had stood before her mother in the same throne room where she had first received the news of her betrothal, and she had formally withdrawn her Kethvalan. The Empress had stared at her for a long time, and then asked a single question. "You found no cause for nullification." "I found 100 causes," Caliph had replied, "and not one of them mattered." The court had erupted, her sisters had whispered behind their hands, and the noble houses had filled the crystal corridors with rumors that ranged from scandalous to outright treasonous. But Caliph had not cared about any of it, because she had seen something that none of them had seen, and she could not unsee it. Now the wedding day had arrived, and with it had come the humans. They had arrived aboard 3 ships, the battered heavy cruiser that had carried the original delegation, and 2 smaller vessels packed with what seemed like an impossible number of people who all wanted to witness the event. And within hours of their arrival, the carefully curated elegance of the Cytheri Palace had been thoroughly disrupted. Human laughter echoed in halls that had known only measured silence for centuries, and the smell of something the humans called barbecue drifted through corridors that had never experienced cooking aromas of any kind, because Cytheri food was consumed in its natural bioluminescent state. And Marcus's best man, a stocky red-haired soldier named Sergeant Torres, had gotten lost 3 times in the crystal maze of the palace, and had been found on the last occasion cheerfully chatting with a scandalized Cytheri guard about something called baseball. Caliph's chief advisor Pelith had documented all of this with a facial expression that suggested he was in physical pain. But Caliph had read his notes later and found that beneath the careful diplomatic language, even Pelith had been unable to hide a grudging fascination with the humans and their relentless refusal to be intimidated by anything. The ceremony was set for the hour of convergence, a traditional Cytheri wedding time when the palace's crystal structures aligned with the planet's magnetic field, and the entire building sang with a deep harmonic resonance that the Cytheri believed blessed new unions. The Crystal Throne Hall filled with guests from both civilizations. Scythery nobles, in their flowing luminescent garments, seated on one side, and human delegates in their dress uniforms on the other. And the contrast between the two groups was so stark that it almost looked like two different paintings hung side by side. The Empress sat upon the crystal throne above it all, her bioluminescence burning at its brightest, and her expression was unreadable. Caliph entered the hall first, as tradition demanded, and the Scythery guests glowed in greeting as she passed, their bioluminescence rippling in waves of acknowledgement and respect over her like warm water. Then Marcus entered, and Caliph felt her breath catch. He was wearing his dress uniform, the deep navy blue of the Terran Confederacy with silver trim, and every medal he had earned was pinned to his chest in neat rows, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine, and for the first time since she had known him, there was not a single smudge of grease anywhere on his person. He walked with the steady, measured stride of a soldier, and his brown eyes found hers across the length of the hall, and he smiled. And it was the same warm, unguarded smile she had seen on the streets of Haven. He reached the altar and stood beside her, and Caliph noticed that his cybernetic hand was trembling slightly, and she realized with a rush of warmth that he was nervous. The officiant, a Scythery high priest whose bioluminescence was so bright with ceremonial power that he was difficult to look at directly, began the traditional words of binding. Ceremony required an exchange of vows spoken first in Scythery and then in Terran Standard, and Marcus had learned his Scythery vows phonetically over the previous weeks, practicing with a dedication that had impressed even Thyrus. And when he spoke the ancient words, his accent was terrible, but his sincerity was unmistakable, and Caliph felt her glow brighten in response. Then the attack came. It hit Marcus like an invisible wall, a psychic assault of such concentrated malice that even Caliph staggered from the shockwave. And across the hall, every Scythery present gasped as the psychic disruption tore through the ambient field like a blade through silk. Marcus's knees buckled, and blood began to flow from his nose, and his face twisted with a pain he could not understand, because he could not sense the psychic field, and had no frame of reference for what was happening to him. All he knew was that every nerve in his body was suddenly on fire, and his vision was going dark. The edges, P. The attack was a weapon called a Kethshara, a banned psychic technique that targeted the neural pathways of any being within range, and it had been deployed by members of the Purist faction, a group of Scythery nobles who had opposed the treaty from the beginning, and who had decided that the most effective way to prove human weakness was to show the entire court that a human could not even stand upright under psychic pressure. They expected Marcus to collapse, to fall to his knees and prove to the assembled nobility that humans were too fragile to stand beside Scythery royalty. They did not know Marcus Cole. He staggered, but he did not fall. His cybernetic hand clenched so hard that the metal fingers ground against each other with a sound that echoed in the suddenly silent hall, and his other hand, his flesh hand, reached out and gripped the edge of the altar to steady himself, and blood dripped from his nose onto the crystal floor in small dark drops. The pain was beyond anything he had ever felt, worse than losing his hand on Hallis 4, worse than the burns and the shrapnel and the long months of siege, because this pain was inside his skull, and there was nowhere to hide from it. But Marcus Cole had spent 11 months in a ruined city telling his soldiers that they would not break, and they would not bend, and they would not give one more inch of ground, and he had meant every word. And the same iron will that had held Hallis 4 now held his spine straight and his legs steady. He looked at Caliph through a haze of agony and blood, and he did not kneel. Caliph felt something ignite inside her that she had never felt before, a fury so deep and so bright that it burned through every layer of restraint and propriety and royal composure she had ever been taught. She turned toward the source of the attack, and she unleashed her bioluminescence at full power. The light that exploded from her body was blinding, a radiance so intense that the crystal walls of the hall amplified it 1,000-fold, and every shadow in the room was obliterated, and the psychic attack shattered like glass struck by a hammer. The purists, 3 nobles in the upper gallery, crumpled under the force of her counterstrike, their own bioluminescence flickering and dying as Kaleth's royal power overwhelmed their treason. The hall fell into absolute silence. Kaleth turned back to Marcus, and she caught him as he swayed, her hands on his arms, her glow still burning so bright that it cast his face in silver and gold. "You can kneel now," she whispered. Marcus looked at her through the blood and the tears that the pain had forced from his eyes, and he smiled, that same impossible, stubborn, warm smile. "Not yet," he said, and his voice was rough and broken but steady. "We have not finished the vows." The silence held for one heartbeat, and then another, and then something extraordinary happened. A single Cytheri noble in the front row began to glow. It was not the polite luminescence of social acknowledgement, or the bright radiance of ceremony, but the deep golden light that the Cytheri reserved for one purpose, and one purpose only, the recognition of extraordinary courage. Another noble joined, and then another, and then an entire row, and then the light spread through the Cytheri side of the hall, like sunrise breaking over a dark horizon, until every single Cytheri in the Crystal Throne Hall was shining with the golden light of the highest honor their civilization could bestow. And above them all, on the crystal throne, the Empress herself began to glow, and her light was the brightest of all. The human delegates did not understand what was happening, but they could feel it, a warmth in the air that had nothing to do with temperature. And Sergeant Torres in the front row was crying openly, and not even trying to hide it. High Priest completed the vows with a voice that shook with emotion, and when the final words were spoken, Kaleth took Marcus's face in her hands, his human face, with its scars and its blood, and its plain brown eyes that held more courage than any psychic gift could ever match, and she kissed him. And the Crystal Throne Hall sang, not with the harmonic resonance of magnetic alignment, but with something older and deeper, the sound of 10,000 years of crystal responding to an emotion so powerful that it resonated through the very foundations of the palace. The war was over. The treaty was sealed. And across the galaxy, the message spread faster than light, carried by every diplomat and soldier and merchant who heard the story of the human who would not kneel. Years later, a Cytheri historian named Paleth, the same advisor who had once documented human behavior with thinly veiled disapproval, published a work that became the most widely read. In its final chapter, he wrote about the marriage that changed the shape of the galaxy, about a princess who rejected a wedding, and an alien captain who was covered in engine grease, and about the moment when 2 civilizations stopped being enemies and started being something new. He concluded with words that were eventually carved into the base of the memorial at Argent Crossing, beside the names of the dead from both sides. We asked ourselves for generations what made humans worthy of standing beside us, but we were asking the wrong question. We should have asked what made them unstoppable, and the answer was the same. They choose every single day to care about their people, about their enemies, about a galaxy that did not always care about them. And that choice, made freely and renewed with every sunrise, is the most powerful force we have ever encountered. Stronger than psychic energy, stronger than crystal, stronger than 10,000 years of history. Because it cannot be inherited or commanded or taken away, it can only be given, and they give it to everyone. The book was titled The Human Heart, and it was required reading in Cytheri schools for the next 300 years. And on the mantle of a home on New Cascadia, where a former captain and a former princess raised children who glowed with soft light and laughed like they meant it, there sat a single photograph from the wedding day. In it, Marcus Cole stood at the altar of the Crystal Throne Hall, with blood on his face and fire in his eyes, and the light of an entire civilization shining around him.